Tales of vampires are quite popular in modern times, and never is that more true than as the season draws near to Samhain, aka Halloween. They are often presented more as exotic than terrifying, and this portrayal has its origins in the 19th century tales, most especially Bram Stoker's Dracula, which presents a vampire as an intelligent, seductive creature that might lure men or women to destruction through their wiles. Dracula is able to live the life of a Transylvanian lord while being a vampire. But where do these 19th century stories of Dracula and vampires come from? Were titillating stories of these Romanian vampires literary inventions, or do they have a more ancient origin? Scouring tombs and tomes of medieval and ancient Europe, I will attempt to find the true origin of the vampire. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting the channel through Patreon or PayPal. 1,000 thanks to all of my supporters. Bram Stoker, a great Irish writer, is most famous for popularizing the more modern conception of the vampire with his depiction of Dracula. Making very tenuous connections to Vlad the Impaler, the reality is that Bram Stoker's Dracula was based almost entirely on Bram's own imagination, not any historical figure. Bram had spent extensive amounts of time studying Eastern European folklore in preparation for writing his novel. Many texts had been circulating Europe since the 17th century, dealing with the question of vampires, with even the famous philosopher Voltaire weighing in on the existence of the creatures. John Polidori, an English writer, released one of the first influential works of fiction on the question with his novelette, The Vampire. Released in 1819, the vampire in his work is named Lord Ruthven, and he seems to have been a strong basis for Bram Stoker's Dracula. In The Vampire, however, much of the drama takes place in Greece rather than Transylvania. They both picture the vampire as seductive, elite, and intelligent, with a great desire to corrupt people before killing them. However, Stoker incorporates more folkloric elements into his tale and brings up the matter of God and of evil, which Polidori strangely ignores. But one interesting aspect seems to be that he incorporates the genuine idea found in Greek and Romanian folklore that the vampire in fact starts off as mortal, and is therefore more akin to a witch or sorcerer. But for those of Central and Eastern Europe, at least during the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, vampires were not some interesting characters in fantasy or folklore, but were very real, at least in the minds of the people of the time. To really begin this investigation into the origin of vampires and the tales that inspired writers like Bram Stoker, it's best to start with the word itself. Vampire isn't a Romanian word, something which may be a surprise to some. The word for vampire in Romanian is actually Strigoi, a name likely going back to the Greek strix, meaning screecher, referring to a screech owl, but in antiquity also referring to an ill-omened bird or a witch, giving us our first clue to ancient continuity. But the term vampire is actually derived from Slavic, and it is found for a word for a creature akin to a vampire in most Slavic languages, appearing as upir in Russian, and something similar in most others. Some have claimed that it was actually a Turkic borrowed word, but recently this theory has been largely discarded. It might have even been the other way around, where Tartars borrowed the word ubir to refer to a witch. It appears to be of Proto-Slavic origin, meaning something like flyer. And we can then look at the Romanian, Roman, and Greek Strigoi, and how it refers to the owl, but in some cases also to a witch or a vampire. So vampire likely refers to a flying creature, and the Strigoi also refers to a flying creature, specifically an owl. And so both of these, although different words, likely come from a very similar origin. We can compare this to the similar Volkula in English, meaning the werewolf, from Volk meaning wolf, and Dolk meaning a pelt or hair, so wolf pelt or wolf fur. A slightly different construction, but with exactly the same meaning as Germanic werewolf, showing that this idea had an Indo-European root. In contrast, the vampire appears to be linked to sorcery and witchcraft. In some European cultures at least, a similar shared idea may have existed about a creature that took the form of a deadly nighttime bird. One important concept about the vampire in several iterations is that it consumes human blood or human flesh. Our most ancient sources that deal with the dead's need for blood is none other than Homer. In the Odyssey, Odysseus must travel to the land of the dead to obtain knowledge from the deceased seer, Tiresias. He likewise speaks to the ghost of his mother, Achilles, and Agamemnon. Before speaking to him, they must be allowed to drink the blood of a goat he has emptied into a pit. The blood gives strength to the spirits to recall their life and to speak with him, and they greatly desire it. It is in fact the blood which draws them there, like moths to a flame. Only Tiresias is able to recognize him and speak before drinking the blood, due to his exceptional abilities. The vampire likewise must consume blood to maintain its strength. This was not only a literary practice. Chthonic blood sacrifices were occasionally made to dead heroes, typically at the site of their graves at night. There was a widespread belief across ancient Europe that the dead still required food. The Bell Beaker Indo-Europeans were burying people with food as early as 2400 BC. The purpose of this food is sometimes thought to be symbolic, but if we look at the ancient beliefs and folklore that comes down to us, even from much later times, it's very likely that this food had a real purpose intended for consumption by the deceased person or their spirit. Romans would later leave cakes, grains, or give milk to deceased relatives, and it was thought their spirits were nourished in some way by these offerings. In some more extreme examples, there are holes bored through stones that cover the entrance to some tombs. In Ireland, we know from medieval accounts that sometimes food was actually passed through these holes as offerings to the dead within. From this general idea of pacifying the hunger of the dead, we don't have far to go to understand the origin of the vampire. The hungry dead were feared, for if not placated, they may decide to roam from their resting places and find something to eat. While the scene from the Odyssey concerns spirits, though exactly how spirits can consume blood is something of a mystery, there are figures like the Norse Draugr and various scenes from Gaelic tales which show the belief that the corpse itself rises and walks again. They dwell in barrows, and they have the potential to leave them. Like vampires, the Draugr can shapeshift, often into the form of a seal. They are able to enter people's dreams and prefer the night, though are not harmed by the daylight, and we will see neither are vampires. To destroy the Draugr sometimes requires it to be wrestled back to its grave or to be beheaded, as found in many later vampire tales. They were conscious, intelligent beings, not zombies, but they were attached to the physical corpse of a dead person. How ancient some of these beliefs are is impossible to say, but we do know with certainty that they, at the very least, predate any written records, and may even shape burial practice. Why is it that many were kept in sealed tombs beneath stones? Status certainly played a role, but the nature of the burial also serves as a type of prison for the corpse, more secure than simply earth. Sometimes strange practices have been uncovered, such as people buried face down, bound, or with heavy stones placed upon them, or even jammed into their mouth after death, showing a fear that these dead bodies may still pose some kind of threat. Roman and Greek sources say that Germanic and Celtic people used to go to the grave mounds in order to commune with the dead. They would sleep upon the mounds and receive dreams or visions from dead persons interred within. Something reflected in some of the Old Norse sagas. The god Odin also communicates with the dead seers to obtain prophecy, for just like in the tale of Odysseus, the dead possess greater knowledge of things that have been and things that have yet come to pass. The dead possess great knowledge, and so the highly intelligent vampire is not an anomaly, but in keeping with similar beings across Europe. The oldest Samhain or Halloween tale known from Ireland is that of Nera, who is dared to go in the middle of the night and put a loop around the foot of one of the hanged men who are still swinging from a tree outside. Criminals executed likely as part of a ritual sacrifice held the day before. Agreeing to the challenge, he does this, but the dead man speaks to him, demanding that he be carried to a nearby house for a drink. Nera has no choice but to comply, and when the dead man reaches the house, he drinks from all the buckets of water and slop that is within. Then he spits it into the mouths of the sleeping people inside, killing them with the drops of water from his lips. The tale says this is why one should never keep basins of water, slop, pails, or fire without sparing once you have gone to sleep, for the walking dead may well enter your house and use it to kill you. Unfortunately, there isn't much we can do with modern toilet design. Maybe ensure you close the lid on that thing before sleep, especially on Samhain. With Draugr and the Gaelic revenants, there is a sense that they spread disease and sickness, death perhaps linked to the corruption and uncleanliness of the dead. Knowledge of germs is modern, but ancient peoples were aware that unclean things were associated with sickness and death, and various ritual practices also came to express this. The idea of purifying oneself from wrongdoings is often carried out with some type of physical cleansing ritual in pagan traditions. Even in Christianity, the baptism with water symbolizes this ritual cleansing, which removes one's sins. Evil manifested in various forms spread disease. Sickness often became worse at night, in the dark. Flu season begins with the onset of winter and longer periods of darkness. Crops die off in the winter, the sun loses its strength in the winter, and so all of these things get linked and form the basis of a dualistic notion of the cosmic cycle. Though the vampire may have had similarities to these other European undead beings, they also had their particularities. The Greek name for the vampire is Vrikolakas, but this is not Greek in origin but Slavic, but it doesn't actually mean vampire. Vrikolakas has the same origin as Volkolak. It means werewolf, not vampire. Confused? In some Slavic regions, like Croatia, the word is also used to refer to a vampire. This is likely due to a similarity between both, which we postulated earlier when looking at the etymology. One figure associated with owls and flight, and another with wolves. In later times, in some places, these separate figures become one, or mixed and matched. This shows up in some vampire literature where vampires are said to also transform into wolves and bats, effectively combining both werewolf and vampire into a single creature. The Greek vampire also does not drink blood specifically, but will devour human flesh. They also appear linked to the spread of disease or plague, unexplained ailments, or sudden death, as in fact many vampires are. Historical accounts of vampires from Moravia, now part of the Czech Republic, say that they might appear to people they knew in life shortly after their death, and the person who saw them would die within a few days. If their bodies were dug up, they would still appear soft, colorful, and undecayed, but would smell terrible. If someone was suspected of being a vampire, the body was dug up, examined, and if they were undecayed, they would be beheaded, staked through the heart, and then burned. Such accounts are also related in Hungary and Romania. In one case, the victim's father, who had been dead for 10 years, sat down at the table with him, and he was dead the next day. The body of the father was exhumed and found to be in perfect condition, with blood like that of a living man. The corpse was beheaded. In another case, a man rose up after being dead 30 years and killed his brother's son, and their servant by drinking their blood from the neck, which killed them on the spot. This vampire was ended with a spike through the temple. From the region of Transylvania, the historical accounts say that vampires could drain the blood of the living like leeches and fill themselves on it, until they were so full that the blood would pour from their eyes and seep from the pores of their skin, making them absolutely bloated with blood. Sometimes those who have been sucked by a vampire will also become a vampire in death, although that is not guaranteed. At least one individual hoped to cure himself from vampirism by eating the dirt of a vampire's grave, but to no avail. He still became a vampire after death. He was staked through the heart and let out a terrible scream, and then his head was cut off and the entire body consumed by fire. In the 16th and 17th century, they began to perform this upon anyone who died whom it was suspected may turn into a vampire, so that they might put an end to the vicious cycle. When a few years later a young girl died of vampirism and cited seeing the dead child of a local man, it was found that they hadn't considered that if someone consumed the meat of a cow which had died of vampirism, they would also become a vampire. The body was dug up, found to show all the signs of vampirism, and was beheaded, staked, and burned. Then they dug up 40 other bodies, 17 of which showed signs of vampirism, and carried out the remedy. These actions in Romania were all done under the law, with judicial sanction. Laws on the books in the region laid out legal procedures for dealing with vampires, and professionals did exist that specialized in it, what we might call vampire hunters. For the situation gets more complicated even once living vampires get into the picture. The Strigoi does not only refer to an undead vampire, but also to a living witch or sorcerer, some of whom at least send out their spirits during the night to drink blood. Though most often associated with Romania, the Strigoi are also known in many other Romance languages. Striga in French refers to a bird woman who sucks blood. The Stregonine in Italian refers to a witch or sorcerer. Greek has Strix. The name is even found in Polish, which must have been borrowed from a Latin-based language sometime in the Middle Ages, and refers to what is usually a female demon or vampire-like creature. But it was the Romanian Strigoi and its specific myths that Bram Stoker most utilized for Dracula. He used the name vampire because it was a more well-known term in English, and because in many places there wasn't much, if any, difference between a Strigoi and a vampire, with the terms often being used interchangeably. However, there does appear to be several differences. In many cases, except in Romania, the Strigoi is more often female, and refers specifically to a witch, while vampires in many Slavic regions do not specifically drink blood, consuming human flesh instead, or simply killing the victim without touching them at all, something common to all vampire tales. The specific drinking of blood, or drinking of blood from the neck, is something recorded in a minority of tales. When the witch or sorcerer Strigoi dies, they would reanimate and become even more powerful, but someone might become a Strigoi in a number of ways. though through an unholy life, through improper burial practice, through a curse, and of course, by having their blood sucked by another Strigoi, in many cases, or by being killed or coming in contact with a Strigoi. Male vampires in Balkan countries were also thought to seek out the love of women, motivated by strong sexual desire, a theme that comes up in Dracula and even earlier fictional vampire tales. The union of vampire and mortal woman could actually result in children, who would become a dampir, who some thought would gain certain abilities of vampires without becoming one. In Romania there are likewise the Moroi, children of the Strigoi with normal women. They would be born hideous and with a great amount of hair. The full extent of the powers of the real tales of the vampire shift a little over time and depends on the region. However, one thing you can be sure about: if you find yourself under attack by a real vampire, daylight is unlikely to save you. The vampire generally has a preference for night, but there is nothing to stop it from appearing at high noon or walking in and sitting down at your breakfast table uninvited, perhaps making you its meal. They could take many different forms, but they varied widely in their intelligence, with some being very smart and others being more like drones. Often people are made ill or die from vampires without the creature even touching them or draining their blood. Simply seeing the thing is enough. It's sort of like foretelling one's death. However, unless you are related to a vampire, you are not nearly as likely to be attacked by one, because in the surviving accounts they generally went after family members, often those closest to them. The vampire is also prone to a strange OCD-type behavior found in other beliefs about the dead. So if one fills the grave with many pebbles or other small objects, they would be forced to count them. Iron could ward them off as well, as it does with fairies and the Gaelic Sidhe. Garlic, of course, is a staple, and will provide a shield of scented protection. And big stakes to trap the dead beneath the earth are always a good idea. One thing that I do not believe was ever fully worked out, however, is if the vampire truly rose from its grave, the soil would clearly be disturbed. How the vampire gets out and then returns to its grave again is very mysterious. This led to some postulating that they took the form of mist to get into and out of their graves. All of these curious abilities make the vampire something between a ghost and a ghoul. It isn't entirely physical, and yet at the same time it is physical. This point was one avenue of criticism that skeptical church officials and scholars used to try and debunk the obsession with vampires that exploded in the 17th and 18th century. The Catholic Church at the time seems to have largely denied the existence of vampires, calling the belief in them pagan superstition. In my own view, it seems that the idea of the vampire becomes conflated in some cases with the idea of a witch, establishing some unique characteristics but largely being influenced by the Slavic vampire. Romania is nestled among Slavic speakers and was ruled by various Slavic groups from time to time. Vlad the Impaler, often brought into connection with Dracula, is a good example of this, because his name Vladimir is clearly of Slavic origin, as are many other Romanian names. But the Strigoi, although their name originates from Roman Strix, linked to the murderous witch and the ill-omened owl, but this has been combined with the Slavic undead vampire, which was perhaps earlier on much more like the Norse Draugr and other such beings in European myth. And I think at least some of the deaths attributed to vampires appear more likely to have been caused by diseases. But why were people suddenly obsessed with vampires at this period of time? Because this was an exceptional circumstance. My hypothesis of why there was suddenly in medieval Europe this obsession about vampires had to do with the hungry dead. And that is that the dead were no longer being fed. People used to routinely leave offerings to their ancestors. They would visit their grave sites, pour libations for them, leave them small cakes or other things. But the church did away with these practices. Practices that had gone on in European peoples for thousands of years. And this cultural change might have caused great anxiety about the state of the dead and about how the dead thought about and would treat the living. And this is in fact why the dead always appeared to the relatives, because it is those loved ones who felt a kind of fear, trepidation, guilt even, so that the dead were not able to rest in peace, at least in the minds of their loved ones. Many people were convinced in the reality of vampires, so much so that they would dig up the graves of their relatives, cut off their heads, drive stakes through them. It is a gruesome task which someone isn't going to undertake easily. Some believe that the idea of the vampire began with people being buried alive. It is also the case that when people die or are killed on battlefields, their nerves and the contraction of muscles can sometimes cause them to sit up or move slightly, something terrifying to witness, very likely connected to the idea of the walking dead. Perhaps there are some vampires out there, but likely the majority of these past cases were the result of an idea and conviction that spread among people far more than vampirism itself. They became obsessed with this idea. It is a frightening warning about how far everyday people are willing to go to enforce an idea, dogma, belief, or ideology which has taken hold of their mind. Time and modernity has not made man more rational thinkers, but rather that he cloaks irrational beliefs in the guise of science or progress or any number of other things which he treats no differently in practice than those who dug up the graves of their fathers to cut their heads off and prevent another vampire attack. But what do you think? Are the vampire legends true? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to share your vampire stories with us all. Don't forget to give a like, thumbs up, subscribe, and as always, stand tall.